Could this stuff make Britain a superpower in climate-friendly fertiliser?
Welcome to the first climate show of 2024. Now, a winter chill has swept the country of late, but where I'm going, I'm not going to need any of this. It's a toasty 40 degrees down Europe's second deepest mine. I'm going to tell you what lies beneath and why companies are betting very big on it. Also on the show, as floodwaters recede across Britain, we look at a success story in Sussex where a restored river has had a positive impact downstream. And is there more to be optimistic about than pessimistic about in climate this year? I'll be speaking to one expert who certainly thinks so.
I believe in human ingenuity, and I think that we actually do have the tools we need to tackle this.
But first, just off the coast, deep down here in North Yorkshire, is a potential solution to one of our real global warming problems, and that's the production of fertiliser. I'm going to head down and see it. I'm just about to have the longest lift ride of my life, 7 minutes to get down.
This is the Bulby Mine, one of Europe's deepest.
So it starts off slowly, and you can feel the vibration. That's the air being forced into the shaft, and then you'll feel it speeds up a little bit.
The descent, over 1,000 metres.
So usually this is the worst bit of the mine visit. When I take visitors down, normally when we're riding down the shaft, when people feel the most claustrophobic.
But we've still got much further to travel and we're not on foot.
So this is our chariot for the day. Okay, let's go. So it'll be about 40 minutes drive. And we do go out under the North Sea as well, but hopefully you won't see any fish today.
Things have gone wrong if I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are nearly 700 miles of tunnels down here, and it's a hostile and potentially dangerous place to work. This close to the Earth's core, it can be up to 40 degrees centigrade.
Outcoming vehicles have priority just in case that somebody's been injured or there's some other sort of problem.
This is the deepest mine in Britain, built decades ago to mine potash, a type of fertiliser that requires a huge amount of energy to process. Fertiliser has allowed farmers to grow more food to feed a growing population, but it worsens climate change and often causes local pollution. But where we're heading, they could be digging up a solution.
Oh, he's not kidding, it is really hot out here. Where are we off to?
Yeah, we're on the mining district now, Tom, so just 50 metres through there.
This is so sci-fi.
Yeah, we've had actually, NASA have been here testing the Mars rover.
So Richard, what are they digging out here and why is it so important?
So this is polyhalite, so it's a multi-nutrient fertiliser that we really have to do very little processing with. We just mine it, crush it, screen it, spread it on the field, and that's it.
And what are the active ingredients in here that are helpful for crops?
So we've got potassium, calcium, magnesium and sulphur, really good crop nutrients.
Right. And in what way is this better than some of the other ways of getting these minerals?
Really, because it's quite an energy efficient process. It's very low carbon. We're about 85% less carbon than any other fertiliser produced.
But polyhalite doesn't contain nitrogen, which causes around half of all the emissions from fertiliser, but it could help farmers use less.
So this polyhalite assists the root with the uptake of nitrogen, so effectively you have to spread less nitrogen on the crop.
Right, so it doesn't actually contain nitrogen itself, but it makes the use of it more efficient.
Yes.
And have you got much more of the North Sea to go under here, or have you got a limit?
Absolutely, all of the North Sea. This was formed in 270 million years ago, and it spreads from here across under the North Sea to Germany. So we've got
close to an unlimited supply.
Absolutely unlimited supply. Yeah.
When it's up and running, this machine moves at about 9 metres a day and can extract around 750 tonnes of this polyhalite fertiliser. And there are potentially 4 of these working down here. That is a lot of this lower carbon fertiliser coming out from under the North Sea.
And another company betting big on polyhalite is mining giant Anglo American. This is the Woodsmith project, a multi-billion-pound mine under development just 15 miles down the coast. Many locals were against it, so Britain's biggest tunnel is being built under the North York Moors National Park to help protect the landscape.
We've got a small site that's going to be invisible to the outside world once we're complete, and we're going to extract the mineral via our world-class tunnel all the way from our mine site here at Whitby all the way through to our process facilities at Teesside, where it'll be processed and shipped all over the world.
It's the UK's biggest new mining project for decades and is expected to generate tens of billions for the economy.
Polyhalite's a huge export potential for the UK. We envisage most of our product being exported all around the world from Teesport, up to 13 million tonnes per annum once we're up and running.
It's a huge bet on a relatively unknown fertiliser and relies on a market developing as farmers look to lower their emissions.
We are needing more food with less land, and at the same time we need to reduce our carbon emissions. So agriculture has to go through some kind of change, and we believe that polyhalite is one of the potential solutions.
There's 15 wagons on this rake, and we'll fill each wagon with 60 tonne of poly standard.
Back at the Bulby Mine, they're already selling 1 million tonnes a year to farmers all over the world.
We load 6 trains a day, and we send those 6 trains down to Teesport, where it is then dispatched by ship.
6 trains a day, that's a lot of material going from here. That's a lot of tonnage.
It is, yeah. It's 900 tonne per train. It's shipped down to Teesport last week. They completed a 27,000 tonne boat of standard material to India.
Images of miners working deep below ground in Yorkshire feel like they're from a bygone age. But with fertiliser accounting for 5% of global emissions and Britain sitting on an almost limitless supply of one of the potential solutions, it looks like we'll be sending people down the pit for decades to come. Well, for a bit more on this and how polyhalite fits into our wider issues with fertiliser and soil, I'm joined by Gareth Morgan, who's Head of Policy for the organic group, the Soil Association. What do you think of the potential of polyhalite? Does it look useful to you?
Well, polyhalite isn't something that's banned in organic farming, and in some circumstances it can be used. So it's not like most pesticides, which are completely forbidden. But I think that does raise wider questions about the extent to which farming is dependent on inputs and fertilizers, and relatively small trace elements like polyhalite do have a role in farming. But the question we have to ask is, can we move beyond a farming system which is completely dependent on these external inputs?
Well, this is something I was going to ask you, because I know a lot of people in the world of farming today are moving towards sort of greater respect for the soil, particularly soil biology, and as you say, perhaps less reliance on chemical inputs.
So yes, for organic farmers, the first question would be, how can I set up a system which is centered around the soil and isn't dependent on external inputs? Now, in some situations, both organic and conventional farms are going to need to find their soils are deficient in particular minerals. But over the long term, an organic farmer will be saying, how can I set up my system so that the essential parts of the farming system are recycled in the system? So, for example, using mixed farming, so that you have some livestock, grass, arable, and a system where the minerals and the inputs to the farming are recycled within the system. So overall, we need to be looking ahead to a time when we can't rely on these external inputs like polyhalite.
But the fact that, as you say, it's not banned within organic farming, and also it seems to be acknowledged that it might help make nitrogen input and other things more efficient, suggests there could be a role for polyhalite, and it's, you know, better than some of the other forms of potash mining. Yeah,
and it's certainly in a different class from something like synthetic nitrogen, which is completely forbidden in organic farming, very dependent on fossil fuels, and very damaging to the climate and ending up in rivers causing pollution and so on. So these more trace minerals certainly are important, but in a fully functioning organic system, you wouldn't be needing to reincorporate them.
And even just outside of organic farming, your direct remit, I mean, a lot of farming is moving towards this greater respect for the soil, which you guys have been espousing for decades here. Presumably, this kind of input, which would allow you to perhaps use less nitrogen, could be something that would be welcomed.
Yeah, I mean, the rise of what's known as the regenerative farming movement is an amazing shift that's happened perhaps over the last 10 or 15 years. And farmers really refocusing on the soil, which is at the heart of good farming. In some situations, something like polyhalite might be needed as part of a process of restoring soils to good health. But the long-term objective of farmers at the moment is to wean themselves off this dependence, not least because of the huge cost of these inputs that has to be reflected in the farming prices that are charged at the farm gate.
So a cautious welcome, but used sparingly. And don't forget that the life of the soil is really the king.
Absolutely. Look to the soil to start, and that should be the starting point. In some situations, something like polyhalite might have a role, but not from the starting point of saying, we've got amazing supplies of this mineral, let's see how we can use it.
Thank you very much indeed, Gareth. 2024 promises to be an election year, and dividing lines are already being drawn between the major parties on climate policy. The Conservatives have been criticising Labour over their plans to spend £28 billion a year on green industries. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, has been crunching the numbers to see if it looks plausible.
Labour say they want to spend £28 billion on green investment. The government, the Chancellor, says that could be a big problem for their fiscal rules. Who is right? Well, let's just have a look. We'll start with the big story here, which is the state of the public finances here. You can see that we spend a lot of money, that bar at the bottom there, £1.2 trillion a year. We bring in terms of taxes, the government does at least £1.1 trillion. You can see there's a gap between the two of them. Look at that gap. What's that? That's the deficit. That's where we have to borrow potentially to make the sums add up. But if we just kind of have a look at what's behind each of these bars, look at taxes. Most of that's income tax, VAT, corporation tax, and other bits and pieces. When it comes to spending, which is the bit we want to focus on here, you've got welfare, you've got health, you've got education. They're very big indeed. Net investment, look, I'll just highlight it. It's this slice here. It's not small, it's not massive either though. And if we just take it and we kind of have a look and consider the big investment picture, and this is investment on all things, so including hospitals, schools and everything else, £71 billion, £72 billion, give or take a year. A lot of people are wondering, does this mean if Labour wants to spend £28 billion, it just raises that by £28 billion? Well, not quite, because some of this red bit is already green investment. About £8 billion of it is existing green investment. So in fact, Labour say they just want to raise that. So it's £28 billion in total. So you can see what looks or sounds like a £28 billion pledge is actually a £20 billion pledge. But all the same, it does make an impact. And if you look at the big picture for investment, you kind of see that, but it may be not quite what you're expecting. This is what the government plans imply for total investment, government investment spending in the coming years. So you can see it goes up a bit and then comes down. The Labour plans, if you assume they're all going ahead, look, it's different, but it's still coming down. So not coming down quite as quickly, but nonetheless, it is coming down in terms of total investment. How about the fiscal rules? Well, of course, the government does have this big fiscal rule, which is about trying to get the national debt down. So this is the national debt as a percentage of GDP. The higher it is, the higher the national debt. And they want, by the end of the 5-year forecast horizon, to see it falling. And if you look really closely, you can maybe just about make out that that dashed line is slightly going down. What would the Labour plans imply? Well, this is back of envelope stuff, okay? But here's what they might well imply. That line going up a bit rather than down a bit. And technically, yes, that means they just about break their fiscal rules. But of course, it does depend on whether they want to cut it in the following year. So there's a lot of ifs and buts about this. But the big picture really is this one. The UK is a low investment nation, okay? So when we're looking at how much the government is investing, it's quite low versus most other countries around the developed world. And if Labour's plans do go ahead, have a look at this red bar here. You can maybe just about make out it goes up by maybe a few pixels if those plans come in. If the Conservative plans are implemented, look at the bar. It goes down because you're seeing investment falling quite a lot. So that is really the big picture at the moment. But there are still many months left until the election, and doubtless we will hear more from all of the parties involved.
We're going to a break now, but when we come back, could changing the shape of our rivers reduce flooding downstream? Welcome back to the show. Well, it's largely stopped raining, but in many parts of the country the floodwaters are still with us. But with predictions for warmer and wetter winters, could restoring our rivers to a more natural state help us to adapt? Mickey Carroll has been to see a success story in Sussex.
Britain is getting wetter. In the last few weeks, Storm Henk brought widespread flooding and damaged about 2,000 properties. And with climate change expected to double the number of homes and businesses at risk of flooding by the middle of the century, how can we better adapt? This estate in Sussex thinks it has part of the answer.
Sort of 1860, our family got funded to drain this wetland. So we removed the water from its old meander, we pushed it into the side of the floodplain and created a canal.
Around 15 years ago, they began undoing all of these modifications to restore the river back to its natural state and shape. Is essentially what you've done, taken what was made a very straight river and made it bendy.
Yes, essentially that's exactly what we've done. And the reason you're doing that is because if you straighten something, you can speed the water up, you can get rid of it from your area quickly. But then you've got problems downstream. So by meandering it, you're making the water travel further within your landscape. You're also giving the water opportunities to then spill out onto the floodplain itself.
Being out here is amazing. You've got these ponds that will be coming and going with the seasons, and in spring they'll be full of frog spawn. You've got reeds and marshy plants, and then throughout the whole landscape this really twisty-turny river snaking through. It's really picturesque. But it's also really counterintuitive because we don't like flooding. People don't want their land to flood. In fact, for centuries we've tried to stop floodplains and wetlands from flooding so that it can be used for more useful things. So why would the team here at NEP put so much effort into making their land flood again?
I think we perceive flooding as a bad thing because we see it flooding things that we don't want to flood. So roads, houses, obviously bad. But flooding is meant to happen. Rivers do use their floodplains and we need that space for flooding, but we need it to be in the right place out of harm's way.
In the UK, 97% of our rivers have been changed in some way to suit modern life better. So is stopping flooding as simple as returning all of these rivers to their meandering shapes and connecting them back to their floodplains?
If we look at the floods we've recently had throughout January, river restoration wouldn't have stopped those. The river channels and the soils, everything was really at capacity, saturated, full of water. However, if we look at smaller events, then there is potential to make a difference and reduce the impact.
The other problem is practicality. These rivers have been changed over decades and now there are homes, farmland, businesses and roads on what was once floodplains. So it's clear this is not a solution that will work everywhere. But with wetter winters to come, we'll need to find all the solutions we can. Mickey Carroll, Sky News.
Now, is the world doomed, or at least human civilization on this planet? Well, a lot of people in the climate world would have you think so. But this new book is clearly saying the opposite, not the end of the world. And it's based on a lot of research, a lot of data, particularly looking back at some of the historical trends and where we are today. And I'm delighted to say that the author, Hannah Ritchie, joins me now. Hannah, just first of all, I mean, a very clear title. In a few sentences, why are you so optimistic that this is in effect not the end of the world?
I think I take a very cautiously optimistic take on this, not that climate change isn't a big problem or even that we're on a good trajectory today, because we're not. But I believe in human ingenuity, and I think that we actually do have the tools we need to tackle this. We just really need to get going. So it's aimed as a spur of action to get us going rather than this is not a problem.
Give me an example of why you think the trend in emissions is going in the right direction, here in the UK at least.
So if you look at emissions in the UK, for example, I mean, contrast where I am today on my carbon footprint versus my grandparents, for example, emissions have approximately halved. They've approximately halved in the last few decades, or since 1990. So that is a really good sign of progress. And the big success story there has been coal, getting rid of coal in the electricity grid. Now, there's an important caveat there, which is that That's domestic emissions produced within the UK. When we look at what we call trade-adjusted emissions, so accounting for offshoring, which is other countries producing goods that we then buy and consume, emissions in the UK go up by around 40% on our domestic emissions. But even when you look at trade-adjusted emissions, they are falling.
Well, you mentioned consumption, and let's look at growth. I think you've got some data on there that talks about growth and emissions.
Historically, CO2 emissions have been really strongly linked to economic growth, like really strongly linked. What we've seen over the last few decades is that rich countries in particular have managed to what we call decouple emissions from growth. So I think it's often posed in these debates as a trade-off, like either you have a flourishing economy or you cut emissions, and I don't think that's true.
So we've looked very much at sort of global big economic levers, power stations, etc. What about in our own lives? What should we be worrying about, and perhaps what shouldn't we be worrying about so much?
I think the really fundamental things are diet. So one of the biggest things you can do is to eat less meat and reduce food waste. On energy, it's really about transport. So walking, cycling, public transport. If you need a car, switching to an electric car is definitely best. Flying is obviously a big one. And then your home, the biggest one by far there is heating, and they are probably the best alternative as a heat pump.
So give me a handful of things that you think we shouldn't worry about so much.
So I think often people assume that eating local food is the best thing to do for their diet, and actually that tends to have a much smaller impact than people assume. Often organic food is not necessarily as climate friendly as people imagine. People stress a lot about plastic bags and plastic straws, but their climate impact is much smaller than people imagine. So there's a lot of stuff that we intuitively feel makes a big difference, but in the scheme of things is actually very small.
I think I'm quoting you correctly, more or less, when you said that the sort of narrative of doom is a bit of a gift to climate deniers and people who don't want action. What do you mean by that?
I think there's two dimensions to that. I think one is when we just promote the message that it's we're doomed, there's nothing we can do about it, it's too late. I think that can often lead to inaction. We become kind of paralysed and we don't take action. So that's the same in some sense at the other end of the spectrum, where we wouldn't take action because people think there's no problem. So I think this inaction is an issue. And then I think often many of the kind of doomsday headlines, and we've had these for a long time, are often weaponised by deniers.
You're also saying, but there isn't no need to worry. I mean, this isn't, you can just get on with your own lives and everything's going to be groovy.
No, absolutely not. Like, this is a massive problem. The consequences we face are potentially catastrophic. This decade in particular is so urgent for us to take action. So my point is we really need to get going on this. And if we do get going on this, then it's not the end of the world. I think that's where my optimism comes from, is that I think we can actually tackle this.
Well, that's all for this week. Next week, we'll be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of these heat pumps. But remember, for now, you can catch up on all your environment and climate news on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. See you next week. We'll be inside finding out if it's toasty.